Yes, and we have with us, joining us via Zoom, Annmarie Williams, who will be giving us a reflection of sorts on the life of Sir Manuel Esquivel. Uh, Annmarie, good morning.
Good morning, Paul. Good morning, Marlene. And thanks for the opportunity.
Yeah, such an important conversation at the passing of Sir Manuel Esquivel. We understand that you worked closely with him. Would you give us some sort of understanding as to your working relationship with Sir Esquivel?
Okay, in 1993 to 1998, I served on his divisional committee that was Caribbean Shores. And also, I was the editor of the People's Pulse at the time, which was the party organs newspaper. And so we had very close ties, both as the editor and serving as a committee member. And I was also a captain for Polling Area 3, which was the area that I lived in Caribbean Shores. And so, yes, we had a number of interactions.
What are your initial thoughts or initial comments when somebody asked you about Sir Manuel Esquivel? What is the immediate response that you give?
Well, I always say, and if people are avid listeners, when I do political analysis for elections, I always refer to him. He was a quintessential politician. He had the characteristics. He had the characteristics that all politicians, and particularly those who aspire for party leadership, should have. He was highly intelligent. He was a scientist, so to speak, a physics teacher at St. John's, and he was organized. He honest to a fault. He was very meticulous and methodical. Took time out to do the things he did, and always thought about people. Never the kind of politician who would say, "Oh, well, just tell her that, or just tell him that to get him away or to get her away." No, he was really thoughtful, and he didn't tell you the things that you wanted to hear, but he told you the things that came from his heart, the things that were true. Today, a number of people say, the politicians lying.
Yeah.
Well, I find generally Belizeans like when people lie to them. I find that.
Yeah,
And he was a person who would tell the truth
yeah.
at all.
That would have been my next question, just because my generation and people in my age, we were perhaps a bit too young to remember Sir Manuel Esquivel in his time of leadership. I was born in the 90s, early 90s, and I was very young. What, in your working with him, in your coverage of his work, what would you say were those characteristics, and I believe you mentioned some, that sets him apart, or would have set him apart from politicians and leaders of today that myself and my generation know about?
Okay, let me say, with all the accomplishments that he had done in 1984 to 1989, when the party first won, and then in 1993, he was a person who, I just heard Minister of State Zabani saying that they will roll out free education to some of the high schools on the south side. Well, Manuel Esquivel was a person who said it is unfair that parents who have money could get a better education for their children as opposed to those who don't have the same amount of money. And we would remember that it was Manuel Esquivel who brought free education to secondary schools and also to sixth form. Because it doesn't matter how many people drive fancy vehicles. It doesn't matter how a country operates. When you have an electorate that is not educated And a good education is the hallmark of a country. And it doesn't have to be formal education. We're talking about skills training too. If we look at the German model, you don't only help somebody to learn and to teach them how to learn, but you also teach them how to do. So the UDP also established the first Center for Employment Training. And so it was academic education along with TVET type of education. And so that was very, very important to him. And I remember he said, like, we brought free education and then the school started jacking up fees and putting in ancillary fees for them to get extra monies. And then it cost the parents. That made him very, very disappointed because he did something that no other politician or leader at that time was thinking of doing. And then I remember the rural electrification project just before 1998. He electrified the whole area of oh boy, it's eluding me now. But that whole Belize rural south area, Gales Point, Manatee area. And all the people had to do was to go and pay a small fee to put in their light. And he did all those things. Talk about the Southern Highway, starting with the paving of the Southern Highway in Belize City. We look at the hospital. In the 1990s, he started a conversation around health reform. He said that it's a crying shame that Belize doesn't have a modern hospital, state-of-the-art, up-to-date. And so the health reform conversation started with NHI also saying that people who have the money to pay for healthcare should pay for those who don't have the money, those who have to pay, because if you don't pay for a service, then there's no service. And that was his idea. And he started that conversation and eventually established KHMH in 1995. Unfortunately, they lost the elections in 1989, and so the National Health Insurance was actually established by the PUP. But he started those conversations early days in the 1990s because he thought the health and the education of a nation were very, very, very important.
You know, in his passing, and if I reflect even with the last interview we had with his wife, Kathy, about her book, Still Waters, it seems to be a recurring theme where people speak of him and say he was not really a politician. He wasn't going to entice people with promises and words, and in fact was probably more pragmatic than most expect politicians to be. Why do you think, given that, especially what we see with politicians now, that he was still successful, even though he wasn't making all the lofty promises?
Well, he was clearly ahead of his time. He was Belize's Michael Manley. I really felt Michael Manley of Jamaica was ahead of his time. And I saw that in Manuel Esquivel because he was successful because he tried to put himself in the shoes of the electorate, looking at the things that were sorely needed in Belize. If you look back, especially 1993 to 1998, the country really had a boom in infrastructure progress and development. The country really started to look up, as you'd say in everyday parlance.
Yeah.
There was the hospital, KHMH in 95. There was the central bank building in 1998, just a few months before the elections. It was open. There was cruise tourism came to Belize because of the UDP. Then I made some notes here so I would not have
forgot to highlight. But can I just...
University College of Belize actually came in because of the UDP, the Rural Electrification Project, and all those things. So he looked at the needs of people vis-a-vis the needs of the country and was all about development and progress.
And it's definitely so great to have your personal stories to share so we can know more. But one of the things that I know is always brought up anytime we speak of his leadership is the retrenchment around Christmas,
Yes.
1995.
Well,
Talk to us
it was
about
1997.
97. Okay, I'm sorry. But it is always one of those stories that followed him, one of those decisions that followed him. Put that
Yes.
into context for us. When you talk about that term being one where there was so much success, talk to us about how that was a pivotal moment as well.
Okay, we would remember that when Manuel Esquivel took over from, it's difficult to talk about the retrenchment without looking at 1984.
Okay.
When the UDP first came to power in 1984 to 1989, the country was in a recession, and he really had to take the bailout from the IMF and everything, and it went on. So they were really hamstrung in 1984, and up to when they lost the election in 1989, the PUP didn't retrench anybody, but the wage bill was already ballooning and things were bad. It was 84 to 89. There was even talk of a devaluation, and so I remember we having a meeting and he said, this is difficult and this is hard, but this is what we have to do and what needs to be done. Where I think it went wrong is that he didn't, to me, from my perspective, he didn't take on the retrenchment as he should have. Well, he said he had competent public officers, he had competent PSs at the time, and he gave them the ability to make the list of the some people who were almost retired and other people. And we always say that there is where the thing went wrong, because a lot of people were put on the list who were not supposed to have been on the list, and he trusted the people who made up the list. And it was a bad time. They actually said that, we should do it this time, and it was just before Christmas. And with all the good things he did, all the good things, it will always be overshadowed. You will think about it in light of the 800 people that were retrenched just prior to Christmas.
Yeah.
But we always felt that he was messed up from inside. Some of the same public officers that he trusted, they never advised well as to when it should have done. By any measure, it would have been difficult and it would have been hurtful. But I always think that you could have done it at a different time in a different way. So with all his accomplishments, that retrenchment, that was his Waterloo.
Would you say that is what eventually caused him to lose the next general election?
Well, that helped, along with the introduction of the consumer tax, VAT, the value-added tax.
Yeah.
And those were his Waterloo. But at that time, he said, look at VAT. This is what had to have been, this is what we had to do, because the country, economically, the country was strapped, and everybody knew. He wasn't the kind of politician who would have gone into corruption and done this and can't account for that. No. So those were the things he did. And I remember when he was featured in the global publication Who's Who, a publication for executives and professionals who are making a difference in the global market space. He was the one who said they asked him about the choices he made and everything, and he said, he did what he had to do, and if it cost him the elections, like so be it. And I remember interviewing him just before the elections in 1998 too, and I asked him what is it that he would want the Belizean populace to know about the tough decisions he had to make and his style of leadership. And he said, Annmarie, that's very easy. I may not have done the politically expedient thing, but I've always done the right thing for Belize and Belizeans. Yeah. And I could rest well in the night on that, because that was who he is.
Now,
That was who he was. Yeah.
yeah. And I'd love to use that as kind of, each leader will have a definitive style and definitive moments, positives and negatives. And we do have a generation of voters now who, as Paul cited, will not remember him as a prime minister. What do you think should be the takeaways from his time as the leader of the country? What characteristics or lessons or traits should be what he's remembered by?
He was the kind of person who was very definitive in his actions, very precise and precise in that he was true, and he was very, very sincere in his undertakings. That is an important quality, his sincerity. Like I said before, he will not tell you no and turn around and say, oh, I never sure, so I tell her no. And he will not tell you yes and say that I didn't say that. He was a man of his word. And we really cannot be full-fledged, competent adults if we're not true to our word. And that is an excellent trait. Next, he was people thought sometimes that he was stern, but he wasn't always stern and unforgiving. I thought he was very forgiving because some people may remember that he had some rogue ministers in the first year of his tenure. And those rogue ministers went on. Well, he had those rogue ministers went on to continue to give trouble, and that was part of it too. But he was conscientious. He was honest, as I said, and honest to a fault, not just honest. He was decisive. He was a visionary. He had a big picture of what he thought Belize should be and what Belize should be like, with a strong economy and having good fiscal reserves. He was that kind of a person. Yeah. So those are some of the traits. And he talked about transparency. He always tried to be transparent. We would remember during his tenure, corruption was not a word that was floating around like in the last tenure of the UDP. I mean, that was almost a no-no. I'm not saying it didn't happen. But talk about it in your face in the last administration. Yeah. And then he was conscientious. And what people don't know, he had a sense of humor. People look at him and he was always serious and things like that. People think he never had a sense of humor. But if you got close to him, you knew that he had a sense of humor. He was always, I remember when we used to go campaigning only to go to specific people who would want to speak to him during my campaign and other people's campaign. You would always make a list of people who want to see the prime minister for whatever reason. And I remember accompanying him to different houses and so. And one evening there were a group of boys in Coral Grove just shooting the breeze and everything. And one of them just hailed me and like making noise, right? But they recognized me from television like that. And I said, boy, what would I do with him to Mr. Esquivel? Because the guy looked at me and the guy said, he will marry me. So I said, under my breath to him, well, Mrs. Esquivel was along too. And he said, I don't know what you do with him, but I know that you would divorce him the next day. And he had that sense of humor, not the slapstick kind, but the more elevated sense of humor. But he was warm, he was conscientious, he was even-tempered, good-natured, even-tempered in that I've never seen him mad, and I've been around him for quite some time in difficult times. Wow. My first and only ride on the BDF Defender came with Manuel Esquivel, because when I edited the Pulse newspaper, I used to go along with him on tours, take photos and like that. And he had a flyover when they were looking at shrimp farms and doing more shrimp farms and agriculture in the southern part of the country. And we had a flyover during, I'm not sure after which hurricane was it, but I went along with him, with Captain Lizama. He was the pilot, and had to sign away my life because I have to sign up. And I remember him saying, "You need to sign the paper." And Maria said, "Why am I signing this paper?" He looked at me and he said, "Well, it's like signing away your life." I said, "What?"
Just in case anything happened, of course.
Yeah. He looked at me and he said, "Nothing will happen, but just sign away your life here." So, but those were some of the moments that I will always remember, you know.
All right. Well, Annmarie, unfortunately, our time has come to an end where this discussion is concerned. But we do want to thank you for taking the time out this morning to be with us to have this discussion. Well,
Okay. Thank you. Thank you very much. And thank you, Marlene.
Sure. So, Marlene, just to note that the government of Belize, they have scheduled a memorial, a state memorial for Sir Manuel Esquivel for Wednesday.
That's right.
After a procession, that's sometime on Wednesday afternoon. And so that's definitely something we will be covering on that day. But with that, we will be taking a short break. And when we come back, we have Jay Cass with us, and he will be introducing his new song right here on Open Your Eyes. So stay tuned. You don't want to miss that.